Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week we're joined by Dionissi Aliprantis to share his research on housing mobility programs, which use rent assistance vouchers to help lower-income households move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. This is the first of 2 consecutive episodes on the Housing Choice Voucher program. As we discuss in the interview, the paper really has 2 aims, only one of which is obvious from the title. The first purpose is outlining 3 different ways we commonly measure neighborhood opportunity, and challenging one in particular, the Opportunity Atlas, which has real strengths, but also some possibly underappreciated shortcomings. Compared to the other 2 measures, the Atlas often comes to very different conclusions about which neighborhoods offer residents the best opportunities for making a better life. This may seem like a purely academic question, but it does have serious real-world implications. Housing mobility programs, or HMPs, are all about helping people move to better neighborhoods. If one measure says a neighborhood is in the top third, but another says that same neighborhood is in the bottom third, what are we supposed to do? Do we want to help lower-income families move there, or should we be encouraging them to move out? Dionissi and his colleagues build on these insights by modeling HMPs with different characteristics, including changing portability between cities or public housing authority areas, which we talked about in our previous episode with Sarah Strochak, as well as relaxing housing supply constraints and expanding the set of neighborhoods that voucher holders are encouraged to move to, specifically to more middle-class areas and not just the wealthier ones. These changes could lead to surprisingly large reductions in racial segregation, and some changes could be implemented pretty fast. There was a lot about this paper and conversation that surprised me, and unless you know as much about vouchers, neighborhood opportunity, and segregation as Dionissi does, you will probably have a similar experience. So enjoy. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante, Irene Marie Cruz, and Tiffany Liu. Be sure to share the show with your network and send your questions and feedback to shanephillips@ucla.edu. And a reminder for the accredited planners out there, do not forget that you can get AICP credit by listening to the show. With that, let's get to our conversation with Dionissi Aliprantis. Dionissi Aliprantis is a researcher at INS de Leon with a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's here to share his research on how housing mobility programs, which help people move to better and less segregated neighborhoods, can be redesigned to improve participant outcomes. Dionissi, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And my co-host today is Pavo, also in Lyon, or maybe in Paris right now. Hey, Pavo.
Also in Lyon. Hey, Shane, and hey, Dionissi. It's great to see you. Just a little behind the curtains. I think we talked about maybe Mike Lenz co-hosting because he's our resident housing choice voucher expert. Mm-hmm. But I'm excited that it's me, not only because Dionissi and I are fellow Lyonnais these days, but also because this paper might seem like a technical and policy relevant in-depth research study, which it is, but it's also a pretty exciting kind of shots fired drama paper, so we'll get into that. I'm looking forward to hearing kind of some of the political fallout potential after you publish this.
Yeah, tackling a pretty big name in the industry.
Yeah.
Okay, so as always, we first ask for a virtual tour of a place you know well and want to introduce our listeners to. So, Dionissi, where are you taking us?
So I was thinking about this, and as the parent of a couple small children, at this point, my life isn't so exciting. But something that Pavo can maybe add on to is that, I just moved to Lyon, France. It's quite an interesting place. So I was thinking I would maybe take you to Croix-Rousse. So it's an area of Lyon with a lot of steep inclines. So it looks over the city and is really nice.
Also famously great for children.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure they love that.
They love stairs.
Yes. Always good. We went for a nice dinner at a restaurant there over the winter holiday. And it was kind of funny because the upstairs was maybe 5 feet tall. So for me, being over 6 feet tall, and for someone like Pavo, it was just, it ended up being really cute, really nice ambiance. But, when you're getting in, you have to be a little bit careful. That's what happens with these old buildings. And nearby, another place that's very cool is Vieux Lyon, so like Old Lyon. Something interesting there. So they have these like traboules, these like little passages, they have interesting little tours, all these little passages between all the old homes. And something that's kind of interesting about it, speaking of Jeff Lynn's work, is that actually apparently they wanted to demolish the area, or the mayor at some point wanted to demolish the area and put in a freeway.
Louis Pradel, yeah, famously after he went to LA, he got so excited.
Couldn't contain his excitement for it, huh?
Yeah.
So that's just something that, whenever I'm over there and walking around and there's so much character. It's so nice to just walk around. I guess it had fallen into a little bit of disrepair at the time, so that was part of the reason too. But the point is they rehabbed it, and now everything over there is just kind of amazing, and it's really incredible. It's kind of like, times when I've been in San Francisco on the wharf and you're like, oh man, really? Like they wanted to put in a freeway here? Like really? Like, oh man.
Yeah.
So that's Lyon in a nutshell, a few small places here.
I'm also over 6 feet tall, and I've experienced this in other countries. Some Mexico City basements, some parts of Tokyo. I mean, you get it here, even in the US, in the older housing, if it's like 100+ years old, where the door frame might be like 6 feet tall or so. Yeah, it's just what you get with an old place, I guess. People didn't get enough nutrition back in the day.
Well, and the thing I love about it here, though, is we were talking about it over dinner, that it's like, okay, we'll just use that space and actually add some charm. Like, it's all good. We'll make it work.
There's a episode maybe of 99% Invisible or some other show on like the old maids' quarters in Paris.
Chambre de bonne. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Sounds a little bit like that to some extent, especially if it's at the top floor.
I think, these are older because those are like 19th century. The Croix Rousse was like 18th century.
Yeah.
The silk workers. The cool thing about the Croix Rousse too is that it's like the Revolutionary Hill. I think it was the first union in France was the Silk Workers Union of the Croix Rousse. And so part of the thing about those passages through the buildings is like, I don't know whether it's true or not, but what I've heard from lefties is like, they use them to like sneak away when they were fighting the conservative forces trying to oppress the union or whatever. But yeah, I was with some City of Paris people the other day, and I was talking about micro units and how, the shock of Americans to consider having micro units of 200 square feet. And yeah, the Chambre de Bonne, the minimum size now legally is, I think, 9 square meters.
Wow.
Or 9.5 square meters.
Just about 100 square feet.
Yeah, that's the minimum.
Wow.
But that episode was good because they go into the cost. I mean, it's like, it would be nice to have a bigger place, but for these young people, when, during a time in their life, they really are able to take advantage of the city by having that lower rent, very small place to live.
Yeah. I think we've talked about it in here before, and I've mentioned it elsewhere many times. Like, it's all well and good if you're saying people deserve better, but if all you're doing is taking away an option and not providing resources for people to afford the higher quality options that you now have, raised the standard to, then you might actually be harming people. And so how you balance that is a really tough challenge, because it's obviously coming from a good place. Okay, so like the study from our last episode, which is not out at the time of this recording, so neither of you know anything about it. This one is on housing vouchers and was published in the Journal of Housing Economics. It's from September 2024, entitled, "What Determines the Success of Housing Mobility Programs?" With co-authors Hal Martin and Kristen Tauber. Housing mobility programs in the U.S. are sort of a specific application of housing vouchers, and housing vouchers help lower income people pay for rent in the private rental housing market. We talked about vouchers in our previous episode with Sarah Strochak, as well as in episodes 17 and 64, for anyone looking to learn a little bit more. Housing mobility programs supplement vouchers with other tools and assistance to help people move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, which could be places with lower poverty rates or that are less racially segregated. Another one of our previous episodes, number 58, with Craig Pollock, is about the public health impacts of one such HMP, the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. And just a heads up, we will refer to housing mobility programs as HMPs throughout this conversation. As I understand it from the article, there have been 4 big HMPs in the US, and they've had quite different levels of success. And in this research, Dionissi and his colleagues explore how the design of these programs might lead to better or worse outcomes with respect to reducing racial segregation, and specifically segregation of Black households into different and usually quite a bit poorer neighborhoods from white households. By simulating programs with different characteristics, things like restricting voucher holders to census tracts with access to public transit, or enabling people to use their vouchers in jurisdictions other than the ones that issued them, or at least making that realistic to do, they find that program design of HMPs can have a pretty significant impact on desegregating cities. And given that tenant-based vouchers are really one of the only U.S. housing programs specifically focused on integrating cities socioeconomically and at least indirectly integrating them racially and ethnically, that is a pretty big deal. Dionissi, let's start with more background on housing mobility programs. What's their history in the U.S., and what can you tell us about the goals and relative success of the 4 that you discuss in the article? And maybe correct me if I'm wrong that those are the only big 4.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I would start by saying that, this thinking about the housing choice voucher program a little bit more generally and thinking about encouraging moves to opportunity areas is something that's kind of receiving a lot more attention right now. I would say for good reason. There's a lot of good things coming out of that. And so in this paper, we're thinking a little bit kind of more traditionally, though, about housing mobility programs that were kind of some of the inspiration for some of these policy changes. And these housing mobility programs really started with the Gautreaux program. So that started in 1976 in Chicago. And I guess what I would say is I would recommend if anyone's interested in any of these topics, I guess if you're listening to this point, you would probably really enjoy the book Waiting for Gautreaux.
Very clever.
And yeah, people either get that joke or don't. I was in the crowd that would not have gotten it before reading the book. So it's written by the lawyer who actually argued this case. It took 10 years. He started in 1966, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And, the whole idea, the basic premise of it was, look, we've said that public schools in our country shouldn't be segregated by race, at least not legally. And so our public housing shouldn't be either. And it turns out, there were whistleblowers, you could talk to aldermen and all this kind of thing. But at some point, you just look at a map and you look at where units were being constructed in Chicago, public housing units, and you could see that public policy, the government was helping to residentially segregate the country by race.
Was that argument really about housing, or was it also about schools? Was it saying, we don't segregate schools and so we shouldn't segregate housing either? Or was it, we don't segregate schools, but if we segregate housing, we're going to de facto segregate schools anyway, so we have to resolve that for the benefit of schools?
I think it was more that these were separate issues, but it's funny you bring that up because it's an issue that I personally think does not get nearly as much attention as it should. That issue that you just raised is a huge issue. And, going back to the 50s and 60s, you had people like NAACP, Robert Weaver, lots of Black leaders that were very concerned about just that issue. And it's just this whole issue of residential segregation is one that in a lot of ways, I don't think we've really solved. So the thing that's interesting about Gautreaux is that it turns out that Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, was the Secretary of HUD under Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. And, the Section 8 voucher program, the precursor to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the Section 8 program was new in the 70s. I think it started in 74. So it was a new program. People didn't really know much about it. People were thinking creatively about how we might be able to use these programs. And, George Romney wanted to desegregate the whole country using these programs. He saw how successful it was in Chicago, and he thought, look, this is going to be great. Okay, so George Romney lost. He lost that internal debate within the Republican Party and the Nixon administration.
Kind of pushed out of the administration.
Yeah, but the thing that's interesting is, there's a speech by Richard Nixon, which is just super nuanced. He was thinking about these issues, in very nuanced terms. Like he was understanding, well, if you give people kind of freedom to go move wherever, but they don't have the means, does that really turn into access to opportunity? he actually was very thoughtful about this and, thinking about the fact that, well, it's not necessarily bad if you have an Italian neighborhood. That can be a really good thing that, people are able to support each other. That's not inherently bad that people associate with each other. It's when, we're thinking about maybe choices being restricted or resources being restricted. That's the issue. So the history of this is very interesting. But when this was employed in Chicago through Gautreaux, it was wildly successful. If you read the ethnography, I find it quite emotional to read the ethnography because you do have, initially you have this kind of, you do have some hostility and you do have some discrimination, but at some point people end up baking cakes and bringing them over, kids start playing and, people make friends. And I don't think it's entirely perfect, but given where it started from, I'll take it. I think it had some really positive effects. And I think, the thing about Gautreaux, and that kind of leads into moving to opportunity, there's a number of things about the program and housing mobility programs in general that are, really lend themselves to bipartisan support. So when you're thinking about moving to opportunity, which was modeled off of Gautreaux, and it was very heavily influenced by the work of this sociologist, William Julius Wilson, also just, research in general at the time, thinking about concentrated poverty and thinking about why are we really worried about residential segregation? Why are we worried about kind of neighborhood effects? And it's really this issue of when you get concentrated poverty that we want to break that up. So moving to opportunity was designed kind of as the next step from Gautreaux. Gautreaux was in a lot of ways a quasi-experiment. We can talk about how people were actually allocated to different units. One group of people were allocated to kind of suburban neighborhoods that were less than 30% Black, less than 5% with vouchers, and another group was assigned to units within the city that were forecast to undergo some kind of revitalization. And we can talk about, how random it was or was not that people were kind of put to the top of the list and given a unit. I think it's about as good as you're going to get, personally, from what I've read. But MTO, the idea was we're going to actually run an experiment. We're actually going to go in and we're going to randomize who gets a voucher that says, you need to move to a census tract with less than 10% poverty, which was the median poverty rate. This happened in the 1990s. And then there's going to be a group that's just going to get a standard Section 8 voucher and a group that's going to get, kind of place-based assistance, continued assistance.
And the people who get just the voucher, they're free to move to a neighborhood with less than 10% poverty, but they're not required to.
Correct.
Yeah.
They could. And so, yes.
And in practice, they rarely do.
Yeah, they rarely do. And I mean, yeah, we can talk about the design of MTO. There's a lot to talk about.
We've talked about that, I think, in prior episodes, and maybe maybe our one with Rob Collinson might be the best one for detail on that. But just to, add that context.
Yeah. So, so I'll just say one quick note about MTO and HMPs in general. I have a feeling I might come back to it, but there's a couple of things that make it appealing kind of across the spectrum. So one is we don't necessarily have a lot of policy tools that help us really effectively combat generational poverty. It looks like HMPs are one. It's kind of a big deal. So that's one thing. Another thing is it's something Democrats tend to like it because you're helping kind of lower income people. Republicans tend to like it because you're using the open market. You're using housing vouchers on the market. And something that for me, I think, in some kind of conservative sense of the word, in terms of like moving slowly, I actually think a very appealing part of housing mobility programs is that they can be scaled up and scaled back. So this is something that, we'll talk about some of the assumptions in some of our simulations, but you might be worried that, there might be too many people moving and it's going to change the character, say, or the composition of a receiving neighborhood, and there's going to be incumbent response. So people in the receiving neighborhoods might move away. There's a really, really easy and effective way to deal with that with these programs. So the thing is, just start really slow. Don't send many people. It can go very slow. And you can ramp it up. And if something happens and it turns out, the program's too big and it's having too big of an effect, you can just slow things down. Like you can actually adjust on the fly. And I think that's a really big deal, especially when you think about politically actually implementing these.
Yeah. On the flip side, you can ramp it up much more quickly than building homes, for example, as well. And so the opposite is also true if that's your goal or, depending on your circumstances.
Well, if there are rental units available, as we'll get into.
Yes.
Minor detail.
Speaking of supply.
So a couple of things to say about MTO. We'll get into MTO, but I think one important detail about MTO is that I guess HUD, I think they had actually funding something like 9 or maybe it was even like 12. They had funding for many sites. Only 5 cities actually took up that funding. So I think that already is telling you something. So those places were Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, LA, and New York. And so this was done in the mid-90s, actually ran the experiment. Then the other 2 that we talk about a lot are the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program. It's administered by the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. Also very same legal precedent in this Thompson ruling, started in the early aughts. And the Creating Moves to Opportunity program, which kind of a follow-up to MTO, run very recently by the Opportunity Insights team from Harvard, actually implemented in Seattle. And, there have been other housing mobility programs, actually a lot. So, there's been versions of this, say, in Dallas, the Inclusive Communities Project. There have been a lot of other programs, but these are, in some senses, the largest and also the best studied. So we've actually looked at these very carefully. A lot of people have thought about them. A lot of people have written studies, looked at the data. And so these are the ones we focus on these because they're, I guess, kind of maybe the canonical and best known HMPs.
Mm-hmm. This is a totally unimportant question, but having 2 researchers here who are currently based in France and from the US, what is the deal with Gautreau's name? It's a very French name for a 1970s US housing mobility program.
So it was named after Dorothy Gautreau.
Okay. And this is Gautreux. So very French word.
I think it's EAUX. If we're going to get I believe
you can tell I do not know how to.
Yeah, me neither. My written French is quite poor actually at the moment. So, so it was actually one of the residents, a public housing resident, who brought the case.
Oh, I see.
Who initiated everything? Yeah,
that makes sense. All right. Well, I think our focus in this interview will be on the HMP simulations that you put together, which we'll talk more about, and how program design affects racial equality. But the first half of the article is really more about the different ways we rank neighborhoods for the purpose of identifying high opportunity neighborhoods where we want to encourage people to move in these kinds of programs. Could you just describe the 3 ranking metrics discussed in the article: neighborhood quality, the Childhood Opportunity Index, and the Opportunity Atlas, and then what distinguishes them from each other?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about these measures. So we use one measure that we refer to as neighborhood quality. In some other work of mine, we refer to it as neighborhood socioeconomic status or neighborhood SES. It's just a measure that combines 6 variables measuring the socioeconomic status of current residents. These are characteristics of a census tract of a neighborhood that we think might have some effect, say, on, labor market outcomes, whether of current residents or of children in the future. And so these are things like educational attainment, labor market outcomes, share of households with children that are single-headed, and the poverty rate, so something about income. So that measure, the kind of virtue of that measure is that it's very quick and easy to put it together. Mm-hmm. So you're just taking the first principal component. It's a very quick, simple statistical thing that you would do to put this together. It's easy to get the data, and it's a quick, simple summary of kind of what's going on in neighborhoods. It's a quick, easy way to rank neighborhoods.
Right. You can get all of that data from the American Community Survey, just one source that's updated annually.
Correct. And so this is, so that's something nice about it. The Childhood Opportunity Index is an index that's been put together by a group of researchers. I believe they were based at Ohio State at the time, and I should figure out where they are now. But the Childhood Opportunity Index, in some senses, it's similar to the Neighborhood Quality Index in that it's measuring kind of current residents' socioeconomic status, things along those lines. But now they've expanded it to 29 variables. And so the virtue of that is you're going to get a lot more information. So now you have things like test scores in the schools. You have environmental quality. You have, all these other variables that you think really matter for the people that are living in neighborhoods that might have an effect on them. The drawback, though, is that because you have so many more variables, it's going to take time for those variables to be collected, to be measured. You're going to have to go to different sources to incorporate them. But it's the same idea of just, putting all of these different dimensions into one dimension and then ranking neighborhoods according to that dimension. Mm-hmm. So in some senses, these are pretty similar, just kind of philosophically or in terms of construction. And so, the first part of the paper is trying to think about this new measure that just came out called the Opportunity Atlas. And it's a pretty remarkable just kind of feat that they were able, so this is again from the Opportunity Insights team at Harvard, they were able to link census records with IRS data, and were actually able to, kind of look at how kids in specific neighborhoods, how they did in adulthood. And you could look at kind of their parental income in childhood, things like that. You can look at their race. You can look at their gender. So there's this new resolution and this new kind of set of variables that we've never had before that we can use to think about neighborhoods. And those variables in that data set, they've been used to think about housing mobility programs and public housing. So we wanted to kind of kick the tires and get a sense of, what's going on with these data. And so we started comparing these different measures and thinking about how much these matter. So, it's funny because the way we titled the paper, in fact, I don't want to say it's totally ridiculous. It's a little bit ridiculous in the sense that we kind of actually already know the answer. So, you go ask Stephanie DeLuca at Johns Hopkins, go ask, Phil Garbodin. They've done a lot of work on the BRHP already. And they can kind of tell you, and Stephanie was on the Creating Moves to Opportunity team. Really nice insights, but we already know that things like landlord outreach, pre-move tenant counseling, post-move tenant counseling or tenant support, housing search assistance, small area fair market rent. So having rents that will actually, kind of pay more in these higher income or higher rent areas. We know that those things are actually really effective, and they have been for the BRHP. Mm-hmm. But then you might ask, okay, well, some of these measures disagree. If you're designing a housing mobility program, you might say kind of the canonical way of thinking about it right now is, okay, we would encourage people to move to the top third of neighborhoods or census tracts in a metro area. And you say, okay, well, how much do these disagree? So we focused a lot on Baltimore, given its history with the BRHP. And there's 671 census tracts in Baltimore. And the Opportunity Atlas and Neighborhood Quality disagree on 140 tracts, whether they are in or out of the top third.
So that's a lot.
That is a lot.
That's a lot, especially because, the top third is already a lot. So
Yeah, exactly. And
140 is almost a third.
100, it's a lot. So then the question becomes, like, very practically, you pull up a map and you look at the census tracts and you look at the ones, favored by one measure or another, and you start saying, like, very practically, like, imagine Shane Pavo, imagine we are a public housing authority, or we're an administrator like the BRHP. We are running an HMP. We look at that map, at those statistics, and we see that disagreement. How do we interpret it? And how big of a deal is that? Like, should we have some knockdown, drag out fight that, like, it has to be the Childhood Opportunity Index. That's the one that's, really going to make all the difference. So that was kind of our first question. So also there's different levels of disagreement. So the Childhood Opportunity Index and Neighborhood Quality disagree on a lot less. They disagree on 71 tracks on their categorization and being the top third or not. And so then there's this question of, like, how should we interpret that extra variation and that extra disagreement in the Opportunity Atlas? Like, it's clear that because it's based on actual measurements in some sense of, like, people's outcomes, we suspect, and actually we've done some statistical tests, and other, the team there that released the data has presented evidence as well, that there's information about neighborhood effects in that data set that was useful and, like, above kind of what you would get just from looking at kind of current residents. That being said, it is based off of measurements for people that lived in those neighborhoods 2 decades plus ago. So neighborhoods evolve over time, they change. And also they're estimates. And so, they're based on a sample, and then, there's uncertainty that comes along there. And so then the question becomes, how strongly do we interpret that disagreement? How important is it? And how big of a deal should we make out of that?
So, it's really about, for these HMPs, for the public housing authorities, we don't necessarily know where we want to send people if we don't really have some certainty about what constitutes a high opportunity neighborhood. And these different measures that are kind of the common metrics for identifying high opportunity neighborhoods just have a lot of disagreement. It sounds like, actually, within the top third, it sounds like about 2/3 of that, there is disagreement between the Opportunity Atlas and the neighborhood quality metric. But even between the neighborhood quality and childhood opportunity, about a third of tracks in the top third are, they disagree on that. Yeah. So there's just, a lot of uncertainty.
There's a lot of uncertainty. And the thing is, the disagreements between childhood opportunity index and neighborhood quality are relatively small in nature.
Mm. So it might be like the COI puts a neighborhood at the 75th percentile and the neighborhood quality puts it at 60th. Whereas the Opportunity Atlas might put it at like 90th or 20th or something. That's an extreme example, just to illustrate.
Well, no, that's exactly right. And the point is those neighborhoods exist. So there's neighborhoods that if you were using neighborhood quality, it might say, actually, this is one of the best neighborhoods in America for a kid to grow up in. And the Opportunity Atlas would say, actually, this is one of the worst, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that extreme. I thought it was just, is it in the top third or in the middle third rather than top and bottom?
Yeah. So then motivated, I guess, by this disagreement about the top third, we start doing some statistical analysis. And this is one of the things that you see is that's not super common, but it exists. Okay. So you might see a tract where it's like they're ranked very differently.
Right.
And so the question is, how do you interpret that? Is that kind of unambiguous signal that like, hey, there's some neighborhood effect here we really need to pick up on? Or could it be something else?
Right.
And so some of the things we found is when we were looking around at that, one of the things is in some tracts, where there were big changes in population, those were also the tracts where essentially big disagreements between quality and the Opportunity Atlas are very predictive of big changes in population.
Right.
And so this is something where you start saying, well, maybe the reason they disagree is because the residents of the tract have changed a lot since the time when the Opportunity Atlas sample was there.
Mm-hmm.
And another place where they disagree a lot are places where the number of children growing up in that tract, so kind of the sample on which you would estimate future outcomes, is actually very small. So that's a place, you see that there's a lot more disagreement when the samples are smaller. So kind of statistical noise. So the thing is, we looked at that and kind of the takeaway that we found was when you take out the tracts where there's either big changes in population, and so you're kind of a little bit suspicious, or tracts where the sample was relatively small, then all of a sudden the Opportunity Atlas and neighborhood qualities, then their disagreements start looking a lot more like the Childhood Opportunity Index and neighborhood quality, those kinds of disagreements where they broadly agree. There's some disagreement, but there aren't these really strong outliers. So that suggests to us that most likely, some of these measurement issues are kind of driving some of that disagreement. And, when you look at what the Opportunity Insights team did when they actually ran the CMTO experiment in Seattle, they were very conscious of this and they did a lot of adjustments along these ways. So they adjusted for, kind of more current outcomes and more current resident characteristics. So they were thoughtful and they did a lot of these things. But I guess the point from our analysis is that it seems like that's actually really important. That it seems like some of that disagreement is coming from kind of measurement issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I found this section super interesting as somewhat of a index nerd myself, having been in some debates over the opportunity index that the California state government uses to guide some of the affordable housing investment decisions. I think it's a very fascinating arena. And I mean, I'll just, for people that aren't as well versed in this, I want to just give them some of the interesting political dynamics behind this is that, I mean, the Harvard Opportunity Insights team led by Raj Chetty got extremely famous. And because of this important insight that they had and this ability to connect the tax data and to be able to show the factors that are actually leading to people doing better later in life, right? And so previously we were making assumptions that better schools and rich neighbors and better public services, I mean, not unreasonable assumptions that those features are going to have long-term effects, but they were able to show that they did. And what you're pointing out is that you're not disagreeing with their findings in that sense, but you're saying to use those index values now is problematic because those things change over time, right? At the neighborhood level. Is that a more or less accurate summary?
So that is an accurate summary. I would give a little nuance in the sense of, I would say that there remains this very tricky question of causality. And that is, people choose their neighborhoods. And so even when we observe that kids growing up in a neighborhood do well later on, do we know that it was because they were in the neighborhood and exposed to the kind of higher socioeconomic status or the environmental quality? Maybe they weren't exposed to pollutants, or maybe there's a million other things that could be going on. And so the tricky thing is there is this issue about causation and causality that is quite tricky. But I think the thing is that these data do give us a new window on that. And so that's, I still think, quite exciting. And there's new evidence. So there's a number of findings in the research on the Opportunity Atlas that are quite interesting along these dimensions. But fundamentally, there still is this very difficult problem of how do we assess how much of those differences in outcomes is due to the neighborhoods versus, for example, the parental education of the kids that were growing up there.
Right. And I like the way I think your proposal to use why not both and kind of blend the two. And, in neighborhoods where we know that the Opportunity Atlas might be less effective, we weight the more current data-based atlases more. I mean, that seems like a really smart way to handle this. I know Shane wants to get into the policy and get off the index talk, but I did want to point out there's this nice piece on the Opportunity Bargains neighborhoods, which I learned about from Mike Lenz, which I think is a great topic. Maybe just like, what's an Opportunity Bargain neighborhood? Sounds great.
So an Opportunity Bargain, yeah, you want one? I got one for you.
Yeah.
I got one for you. So the idea here is, the question is, can we find census tracts, neighborhoods where actually growing up there or, living there now would have a really positive and beneficial effect on somebody moving there, but the rent is relatively low. And the rent might be relatively low for any number of reasons. Most likely there's some kind of information friction or, whatever it is, people value something else about the neighborhood or other neighborhoods. There's something about the market where actually the price isn't totally conveying the information about what it is to live in that neighborhood. Part of that could just be, it's actually really hard to know. I mean, as someone that, just moved to a new city and you're trying to think of like, okay, wait, where do I move? Where do I send my kids to school? It can be very tricky. And so maybe there are these locations where price is kind of missing some information. And one of the things that we found is that I think there's definitely the possibility of opportunity bargains. I think they could very likely be there. And I think the Opportunity Atlas could potentially help us identify those areas. But one of the issues is it's a little bit tricky to put too much weight on the Opportunity Atlas and finding those. And the reason is, what we found is, if you're looking at tracts that are kind of highly ranked, but also kind of low priced, when you start looking at those tracts, what you find is that those are tracts where there's actually, again, these really large disagreements between, say, quality and the Opportunity Atlas. And so it kind of makes you start wondering, is this a tract that's changed a lot over time?
Right.
And that the price actually is conveying some information to me that...
Right. The time factor seems really important here, where you're looking at, kids who grew up in the 90s or so.
Exactly.
And maybe it was a great neighborhood for them at the time, but maybe it's changed a lot and is not such a great neighborhood now, and that's why it's more affordable. It's not because it has retained all of those characteristics, but somehow remained or become affordable.
Yeah, exactly. And so the finding there is just that, again, this is where, being an index nerd and thinking about some of these statistics, it's helpful because it makes us say, okay, this is a tool and we think it can provide us some insight, but we need to be careful exactly kind of how we apply it and how we think about it. So it doesn't mean that I don't think that there are any opportunity bargains out there. It's just, it's going to be tricky to find them. And yeah.
And presumably fewer and fewer over the years as information becomes more widely accessible.
Yeah.
But back in the 70s, probably there were some really good bargains out
Could
there.
Sneak in all over the place, right? Yeah, bargains everywhere.
When I read through this section, I was like, man, this is a lot on indexes, and this seems like kind of outside my interests, over my head even. But by the end of the paper, and also I think this conversation has helped me understand better, I think it's worth underlining your point, Dionissi, about these are real neighborhoods that we are kind of directing people toward. And whether it's actually a 70th percentile neighborhood in terms of like the opportunities it offers to people and their chances for having a better life than their parents, or a 20th or 30th percentile neighborhood, like that actually really does matter. And we want to make sure we're directing people to the former and not the latter. And so, how we measure these things is not some kind of like side issue that is only interesting. Maybe it's only interesting to researchers, but it's not only important to researchers.
It matters for all of us. Yeah, it matters for policy. Yeah, we want to get it right. That's right.
This is still not policy, but I think it's worth emphasizing because this paper is ultimately, other than the index issues, about racial segregation in particular. And as you say in the article, one of the Opportunity Atlas's strengths, this is the Chetty work from Harvard, is that you're supposed to be able to evaluate outcomes by race using this metric, differentiating, for example, outcomes for Black boys versus white boys. You make the case that this kind of analysis isn't really possible for HMPs, though, and part of your justification, we've talked about this a little bit, comes in the form of this rather depressing passage. Quote, "At the lowest levels of quality," referring to neighborhood quality, that metric, "most tracts have 50 Black boys or more with which to estimate outcomes. But once quality gets out of the bottom decile," and this is me saying that's the bottom 10%, back to the quote, "the number of Black boys is already too low to reliably estimate outcomes in many neighborhoods." That may not make sense upon first hearing it, so can you explain to our listeners what that quote means, both as a statement about the segregation of Black people in America generally, and about our ability to measure HMP outcomes by race specifically?
Yeah, so I think this is an issue that's been coming up in a lot of these discussions about algorithmic fairness and thinking about when you use data from a very unequal or biased society or system, you're probably going to get that back out. There's been an argument of bias in, bias out by some academics. And I think the issue here is it is quite depressing. And the point is, if we want to answer the question, how would Black males do if they had grown up in high income or high SES neighborhoods? Broadly speaking, we don't necessarily know the answer to that question. And the reason we don't know the answer to that question is because we haven't seen it in the data. I mean, we have, but in rare cases. The point is just that is sufficiently rare, and there are sufficient neighborhoods that, didn't have a lot of Black kids in them in our near past, and in some of them even now, that it would be hard to say how would a Black kid do growing up there now, and how would it be different than, say, a white kid growing up there. We don't actually know the answer to that question because we can't just see it. We have to use theory. We have to think about, okay, what are the factors that would maybe make it, better or worse for a Black or white child growing up there? Again, you have to think about, okay, well, what would their parental income be? What would their parents' educational attainment be? How would that interact with anything else going on in the neighborhood? Maybe a Black kid in a high income neighborhood, maybe if it's predominantly white, they might not feel comfortable there. They might have to deal with hostility. And so the broad point is that our society remains and has been so residentially segregated that it's kind of hard to even think about what would our society look like if it were integrated. Like it's just so far from that we kind of have a long way to go. I guess that's kind of a theme that keeps hitting me in my research, is just realizing like, oh yeah, we're really pretty far from where we want to be.
Yeah, and as much progress has been made, and it is real and important,
correct.
There's just so much further to go.
That's right. Yeah. Well said.
I think that sort of leads us to your simulation of an HMP, a housing mobility program, because as you said, we really can't look at existing neighborhoods to find out what happens to Black children in particular, but there's just not enough real world examples of what happens when you put lower income people, lower SES people of different races and ethnicities in higher opportunity neighborhoods that tend to be disproportionately white. And so, stepping back here really quick, as a recap from our episode with Sarah Strochak, vouchers are administered by public housing authorities, and there are 2,200 PHAs in the US, each with its own wait lists and issuing and managing its own vouchers. These vouchers are portable, technically, meaning if I receive one in the city of Los Angeles, then I can use it in neighboring cities like Norwalk or Santa Monica, which each have their own PHAs, as do another 15 or so cities in LA County, as well as the county itself. Or I can also, I guess, in theory, use it in Fresno or Seattle or Chicago or Miami or St. Louis or what have you. But technically portable, technically is the operative word here, because at least as of 2005, which you're just citing a previous study, only about 1.6% of voucher moves involved porting from one jurisdiction to another. You write that this low portability rate is about the administrative burden of actually using vouchers in this way, and we don't have to get into that, maybe a topic for another episode. But instead, I just want to use that statistic as the entry point for talking about how the design of housing mobility programs affects where people actually end up moving and the effect that has on racial segregation. So can you tell us about this reference HMP that you developed? And then for the first tweak to its design, Describe how much its performance improved by increasing the portability of vouchers.
So maybe I'll even take a step back if it's all right.
Sure.
I'll talk about the fact that, so there's kind of a lot of heterogeneity across these HMPs in terms of their design. Things that you might think of as small differences in, design features, there's actually quite a lot of differences across them. And there's also kind of quite a lot of heterogeneity in the types of moves that people made in these programs. And so we're kind of trying to understand, how do these things connect with each other? And so just as an example, you think about programs like Gautreaux and the BRHP, and these are places where a central part of the program itself is that you can take your voucher and it's, the supports are there for the voucher to be used across jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. And then something that, we kind of realized, I've been researching moving opportunity for a long time, and something we went back and read the actual program manuals as a result of writing this paper.
Nice.
And when you actually read the program manuals, you realize, wait a minute, it looks like the vouchers themselves were administered through the Central City PHA. And at least in the program manual, it says, well, you can port them. We can help you with that. But it's kind of like a little bit of an afterthought. And it just makes you realize, wait a minute, porting could have been this really big obstacle in MTO that maybe we haven't appreciated fully, like how it can create a very important obstacle. And is that something that really matters? So again, this is something where, we wanted to step back and say, okay, let's just do a kind of accounting exercise. So
can I just say real quick? I mean, I think the porting thing is, of the different design features you study, that's the main program design one rather than transit or supply, right? That's the thing that the government could change, most easily, I think. And so extremely important. Yes. Do you remember at all the difference in porting rates under these different HMPs?
Well, so I actually don't know that we actually know the answer to that. What I can tell you is things like this. I can tell you that I should actually have the statistic off the top of my head. I have it somewhere on a slide. But, when you look at, for example, Baltimore, I think it was something like maybe 80 or 90% of people moved out of the city school district and moved out of the city. In Gautreaux, it was 100% of suburban movers. Of the suburban movers, the typical move was like 18 miles, something like that on average. Yeah. Whereas in MTO, very few people moved more than 10 miles. Like, I think it was like 10%. Again, I can look up these statistics and I shouldn't be making them up off the top of my head, but
sure
they're broadly characterizing. They're broadly characterizing. I think the big point though is, when you look at MTO versus some of the other, Gautreaux and BHMP, you see that there are real differences in the distances moved. And it looks like that's probably about porting, among other things. It could be other things as well, but it seems like that might matter. And so what we did is we took a step back and we said, okay, let's just create kind of a very simple framework where we said, let's imagine a scenario in which we just very mechanically, we pick people up and move them from this track to that track. And we do it according to these different rules that would be kind of the design goals of an HMP. And then we say, okay, we're going to take into account that there's going to be some friction, that some people won't take up the vouchers or they'll do it in different ways. We bake that in. But let's just do this and get a sense of the overall magnitude. So a lot of the times in economics, when we think about this kind of a program or these kinds of choices that people make, people really want to build in these very complicated models. And I've kind of worked with some of those models, and I think they're very important. Some of the work, for example, by Francesco Agostinelli and co-authors is showing that actually this really matters. And the point here with housing mobility programs is there's some point at which, if you keep encouraging moves, the receiving neighborhood is going to start looking like the original neighborhood, right? And so at what point does that start mattering? At what point do people start moving away? At what point do effects start changing? So those kinds of models are very important, and it's really good that people are doing that. And I'm actually interested in doing that myself as well. But for a first pass, there's this basic question of just like very broadly, assuming that we can keep the program in a, at a level where some of these, what we would call general equilibrium effects, people incumbent response is relatively muted. If we think about this very mechanically, how important are these various components and how important are they for racial segregation? And so one of the things we can do is then we can do these simulations where we move people around And then we just say one by one, okay, let's move people around now instead of saying that they can move outside of their public housing authority jurisdiction and they can move anywhere in the metro area. Let's just assume they have to move within, they have to come from within and stay within a public housing authority jurisdiction, which is actually its own interesting whole like ball of wax, because like, what are the actual jurisdictions? Like, we can find those online, but I'm not sure that everyone really knows. The point is, there's thousands of PHAs and, it gets a little messy. But when we do that restriction, it seems like, actually, when you get rid of porting and you restrict that, you get, I think it was almost 40% of the benefit of the HMP in terms of residential segregation, racial segregation. Almost 40% of it goes away. So that's
huge.
Yeah, it's a huge part of the design. It seems like it's something that's very important.
And if I understand correctly, that's assuming, your baseline is you're free to move across boundaries. And of course, that's not the reality, or at least like people don't act that way in reality. And so your baseline is maybe a little unrealistic. And if anything, we might actually see the restriction as a better reflection of the real world, and the opposite of the 40% decrease as what would happen if we really made it possible to move across boundaries without restriction and people just felt free to do so.
Well, I'll say two things about that. So one of the things is when we're thinking about supply and receiving neighborhoods, one of the things we did is we were speaking with the folks at the BRHP, and they told us, when we think about a receiving neighborhood, we usually think that like, say, 5 to 10% of the rental units in those tracts are actually attainable. We might actually be able to access. And so that's one of the assumptions we baked in. And I do think part of it is in our minds when we're thinking of encouraging people to make those moves, we're thinking, well, we already have these other things turned on. So we have landlord outreach, we have tenant counseling, we have search assistance, we have post-move, like those things that we kind of already know, small area fair market rents. Let's assume all those things are turned on. So let's just assume that this is, this is going as well as possible.
Best case scenario.
Yeah.
Best case scenario. But
and you're kind of taking the HMPs as the baseline, which, I was just thinking about the voucher program overall, which is very different. But within these HMPs, portability is actually quite high.
Assume there's a really good HMP.
Yeah. There are at least a couple of, or one.
Was that a dig at economist, Papa? Oh, man, I'm like, that's how you got to do it, man. I'm an economist here. But I think, it's interesting. So as far as I can tell, and actually, I should kind of ask some of them more explicitly, but as far as I can tell, moves across jurisdiction were not, encouraged or common in the Creating Moves Opportunity experiment, as far as I can tell. And so
this is the Seattle one.
This is the Seattle one. And I think this is, in some sense, there's a lot of things about the Seattle CMTO. So one is you're in King County, you're in Seattle. Like this is, I think, a really very capable public administration. It's also the Opportunity Insights team. Like, they're super sharp. They've got all these people, like they're great. And so it's something that just makes me think that this is a pretty hard constraint that we're facing. But then when you see the success that places like Baltimore and Chicago had when we were able to relax it, it makes me think that we can also do this, this exercise where we say, okay, we're going to target neighborhood quality. We're going to target childhood opportunity index. We're going to target the opportunity atlas. And when we do that kind of simulation, it doesn't really change the overall success of the program that much by one measure or another, a little bit. But the point is, that's not something we should be like wrestling on the floor about. Whereas the porting issue is one that like, it seems to me, it's worth investing a lot of time and energy to try to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, also because it's just something that presumably can happen. It just doesn't. And so, like, clearly there's a problem there. Speaking of Seattle compared to Baltimore and Chicago, a lot more white of a city. And you have some graphs showing how, like, the Black population is less concentrated in the lower income parts of the city, less segregated, let's say. But there's a fewer people. I wonder, did you look into heterogeneity across metros? Because the simulation stuff is for all metros, right? And so did you look into heterogeneous effects?
Yeah, so we
and if not, why not? Because I want to know about
authority,
it.
With emphasis,
Reviewer 2 wants to know.
So yes, so we did look at that. And I think, I don't know if I mentioned that or if you did, or, I think, again, in a lot of ways, the motivation for this project and for thinking about this is that in a lot of American cities, if you just look at the distribution of poor residents and you compare the white poor residents and the black poor residents, what you will see is that there is typically poor white residents are pretty uniformly distributed across poverty rates, across, neighborhood SES. Whereas there's this hyper concentration of poor black residents in the lowest ranked tracts. And, again, if you're at this point in the conversation and you're still listening, I think it's pretty safe to assume you know why that happened. You have some sense. You've read some books. You've seen some documentaries. You've talked to some people. You have some family, whatever it is, whatever experience it is that informs your view on how that came to pass. To me, it's something, the question is, okay, how do we solve that problem? And I don't know that we have a lot of ideas. And so, housing mobility programs were really motivated originally as, okay, let's try to do something about that specific problem. And I think one point I would make is that when you look across all the different metros and you think typically, I think housing mobility programs, this baseline program, again, Shane, so I'm talking about like best case scenario, it would get us about 10% of residential segregation. That's what it looks like. It would get us 10% of residential segregation of poor black and poor white households in these big cities. We could get rid of it with these programs in like a pretty reasonable pace.
You're saying it would reduce it by 10%.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Now, we mission accomplished, right? No. Okay. So, we 10%'s, 10%, but 10%'s 10%. Like, I'll take it. Like, let's like at this point, like in a lot of ways, we were not seeing a lot of the kinds of progress that we're looking for. And so maybe let's do it.
Yeah. 10% might be roughly the improvement we've made over the past 50 years or so.
Exactly. And the point is, then you don't know how, maybe this would lead to other improvements and maybe in concert with other efforts. But I do want to get back to Paavo's comment, though, and that is that, I do think even when you just look at the initial conditions and where some of these different metros are starting from, a metro like Baltimore or Chicago is very different than a place like Seattle, just because of that fact. And so in some ways, that's why it's interesting to be looking at different programs across different sites and thinking about, again, part of it's the design and part of it's kind of like, where you're lining up and where you're implementing these programs.
I think this is an important conversation and ties to some work that has really been front and center for Paavo the last few years, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing and really building housing in higher opportunity neighborhoods. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, Paavo, and the juxtaposition of these two things of in California and at the federal level here, a lot of our focus has been on this affirmatively furthering fair housing program or mandate. And that's seems to really be about building homes in higher opportunity neighborhoods. And so how does that compare to this kind of program, which is about just moving people into them?
Well, yeah, but I think these were inspired in the early 70s by the AFFH mandate. I mean, that's what Romney was trying to realize through multiple means. So he was doing model communities or whatever it was called, where he's trying to build public housing in white suburbs. And he was also doing mobility stuff. And I mean, they would work hand in hand. I mean, I think that's something that I appreciate, and I've probably already talked about, and we'll talk about more on this podcast about European housing policies where like things work together and demand side supports the supply side approach. But I think that, I mean, it really, that's why I was really interested in the portability issue being something that's potentially more easy to resolve than the supply issue. And so like this AFFH that I've been doing has been focusing on the lack of even any kind of multifamily or rental housing in the high opportunity neighborhoods, and how do we change that supply situation. And that's an important part of this paper's findings as well. So maybe Dionissi, you want to talk about comparing supply to portability?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, I just want to say, everything you just said makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, so one of the issues is about the supply of housing in some of the higher opportunity areas. It can be quite low. And so one of the ways that we try to quantify that is said, well, so, in the baseline, we say that there's this constraint that you can move in up to 30 families. But if you hit a constraint that there's only 7.5% of the available rental stock there is under that, that's how many people you can move in. That's how many families. We respect that as a supply constraint in the receiving neighborhoods. We say, well, what if instead of that, we said we had the same kind of constraint, but we focused on the middle third of neighborhoods? Because, this is the other thing is it turns out that actually an understanding of neighborhood effects, we can really easily come up with examples in our own lives. So I can tell you, my 3-year-old that's here in France, had we stayed in the United States, her French would not be as good as it is now. Like now, French is her first language and she's very comfortable with it. And it's very clear. I can tell you.
Neighborhood effects, they matter.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we all have that intuition, but then, trying to actually generalize that and find them, in an experiment or in a broad sense, they're actually very difficult to identify, it turns out. And a lot of the evidence we have are typically very localized. But so maybe it's entirely possible. And so, like Bruce Weinberg at Ohio State has some evidence along these lines. It might be the fact that just moving from, like, say, for example, the most disadvantaged neighborhoods to relatively, say, middle-class neighborhoods, that actually might give you a lot of bang for your buck. That actually might really matter for a lot of people. And so let's just think about that. And it turns out that because the supply constraints are so high in the highest third of tracts, that you would actually do a whole lot better if you actually were focused just on the middle third. Mm-hmm. And that's, I thought that was something maybe a little bit surprising to me or counterintuitive, because you aren't increasing the neighborhood SES by as much, but you're doing it for more people.
Mm-hmm.
So then you start getting into all these questions of, okay, well, if we were going to target the middle third of neighborhoods, maybe it would be tougher for them to absorb people, or maybe it would be easier. I don't know. Yeah. And then you start wondering, well, what about the people in the program? Maybe their experiences, maybe they would actually be even better. I don't know. But it's trying to suggest that just starting from the point of, housing supply, this seems like something that really matters.
Right.
And then thinking very broadly about, okay, should we just target the top third of neighborhoods by, whatever ranking, or should we think maybe there's some scope for broadly thinking about trying to encourage people to move, just kind of to improve the overall neighborhood SES where they move?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it brings up a really important research gap that may never be fillable as this, how much better is it to live in a very rich neighborhood compared to a pretty rich neighborhood compared to a medium rich? And I think you get, maybe better physical amenities in schools, but then maybe the social peer effects. Like I've seen some research that's not totally convincing. I think Gulster's done some stuff on this. It's definitely cited this stuff, but all the different kinds of neighborhood effects and the social stuff, maybe like you sort of mentioned before, you'd be better off moving to a neighborhood that's kind of the next social class above yours rather than the top, right? Because you might fit in better and this kind of thing, especially for young people.
Yeah.
And from a policy perspective, it just seems like why not both again? And just instead of like with the HMP super targeting the highest opportunity, like worrying a lot about the highest opportunity neighborhoods to target them, it might just be easier to say, okay, well, anything in the top half or something,
Like, is it more important to get to the top or is it more important to get out of the bottom?
Right.
I wouldn't claim to know the answer to that. I would just say this is the kind of research where, it's pointing in the direction of, okay, we should try to find some evidence on that question. And like you said, Pavel, I'm not sure that we'll ever.
If it's at the risk of losing some people being able to lease up, then that's a big risk.
Well, and this all seems kind of downstream of the segregation as it exists today. And we should be clear, you're just measuring racial integration. And so because Black households, and you're measuring Black-white segregation in this study specifically, because Black households are so concentrated in the bottom, not even necessarily third, but even 10% in places like Baltimore, that moving to the middle third is a huge change demographically in the neighborhoods. It might be the case that it's not as impactful to your school outcomes, to your future earnings, to your health, those kinds of things. I could absolutely see reasons that it would be, but it's, it really depends what you're measuring.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, the other thing I would just say is some of my more libertarian-minded economist friends would point out...
Isn't that all economists?
Well, I do think there's...
Okay.
So I'll say this. So I think there is this point, though, of... We can talk about frictions coming from the Housing Choice Voucher Program or from public housing provision. But I think there's also this issue of, if people are choosing a place to live, it could be constraints, but it could also be that that's optimal for them. That's, and I think...
Could be preferences.
It could be preferences. And I think in some sense, what I like about economics in some cases, the point is, okay, you've got to figure out why are people making that choice? Like that's the whole point. That's what's interesting. And so, as an example, in some of my other research, we were thinking about the racial wealth gap and its implications for kind of differences in neighborhood sorting and cross race by income. So conditional on income, Black and white households live in very different neighborhoods in terms of poverty, in terms of unemployment, neighborhood SES. So when we started thinking about that, it said, it's got to be the racial wealth gap. It's got to be that you got to buy a house in a lot of those neighborhoods. There's a friction in the credit market. That's what's going on. Everybody knows this. I knew it. Everybody. Well, we were just going to run the regressions and show, this is one more reason we care about. Well, it turns out it's not about wealth. And it turns out you start reading some ethnography, presenting this and talking to people and hearing from people. And it's like, well, part of it is white hostility. I don't want to be in a neighborhood where people are just being jerks to me all the time. And not everyone. Point is,
it doesn't take much to feel unwelcome. Yeah.
It's psychologically costly.
Quality of life.
Yeah. And those psychological costs can be really high. And so, again, it's one of these situations where it's hard to know how much of it is a friction and an information issue and how much of it is actually that might be the best place for someone, whether it's social networks or whatever. I tend to think that that's less frequent. But the point is, I had this kind of humbling experience thinking about the racial wealth gap. So the point is, I think it's important to be open and to realize that we have this very mechanical model of just moving people around, but obviously life is more complicated.
Yeah, I think the housing mobility programs are a surprisingly strong-handed policy in the United States, and generally we don't do this. And it's not based on race anymore, but it is surprisingly kind of explicitly
impacting.
I use in my class an example from Singapore about how they restrict home sales based on ethnic quotas as trying to pursue a kind of a noble goal or a benevolent goal of having social mix, but in this very kind of authoritarian way. And this is a policy that is also a good goal, but maybe too aggressive. But is it not the case then, if you're selected, you can't get a voucher unless you move to one of the selected neighborhoods, or is there a...
So that is actually, I think, perfect. You raised a really nice point that I think the CMTO team has made really, they've highlighted in a really nice way that the current thinking about it is encouraging moves, right? Encouraging moves, like creating these moves and saying, look, we're going to provide you the information. If you still think that you would rather be in one of these neighborhoods, okay. But, again, what they found in Seattle and what, I think Stephanie DeLuca and some of her colleagues have found in Baltimore is that a lot of it is, it's intimidating, or it's a lot of work. And let me put it like this. I've recently moved. I have kids. I'm working. I'm busy.
It's a lot of work.
Maybe actually I did say it right. It's a lot of work. It's a lot to figure out where you want to move, right? And if you're working and you have kids, or whatever number of reasons, having a little support can actually go a long way. And sometimes it's just psychological or emotional support. And especially when you think about some of the issues about race and poverty, just somebody encouraging you, like, actually, you can go there. It'll work. Give it a try. But I do think there is this bigger issue of, how paternalistic it can be, and that encouraging the moves rather than requiring them. I do think that's an important point too.
Okay, I think we will close it there. So Dionissi Aliprantis, thank you so much for joining us on the Housing Voice podcast from Lyon.
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. It was great. Thanks, Dionissi.
You can find a link to Dionissi's work on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on the socials. I'm on Blue Sky at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is there at El Pavo. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.